you should be absolutely ashamed of yourself for the demonstration. Mr. Van Buren, I just want to start by saying that you should be absolutely ashamed of yourself for the devastation that you have caused to communities all over the world. Already, you are responsible for so much death and suffering.
In the run-up to the panel on the day, I was shaking and I was having palpitations all morning, like a completely new level of anxiety. But when Ben Van Beurden walked backstage and I saw him with my eyes, I knew that this was something that I was able to do.
No matter what he says today, remember, Shell has spent millions covering up the warnings from climate scientists, bribing politicians and even paying soldiers to kill Nigerian activists fighting against them. All whilst rebranding to make it look as though they care and that they have the intention of changing.
Why I got so emotional and upset during my speech is I genuinely believe that Ben Van Beurden is one of the most responsible people for the climate crisis in the world. And as I said, so many people are already dying disproportionately in the global south due to the climate crisis.
This is not an abstract issue, and you are directly responsible for those deaths.
People like him, largely older white men in power, like to pretend that the climate crisis is a future issue. This is not a future issue, and it's coming, even in the global north, a lot sooner than we think. In the last few years, we've seen increasing weather-related incidents that are so terrifying all over the world, not just in the global south. But something that is so important is that this is killing people all over the world. The International Energy Agency has just earlier this year stated that in order to stay below 1.5 degrees of global temperature rise, there must be no new fossil fuel investments anywhere in the world. The climate crisis is a really complex global issue that needs global solutions, and it needs world leaders from all over the world really coming together and think, how can we tackle this, and really feeling the fact that every day that they do not act is a day that will cause more people to die from the climate crisis in the future. And I don't think that we have seen those radical commitments anywhere in the world. The climate crisis and racial injustice and class injustice, all of these systemic issues, systemic oppressions, have the same root cause, and that is capitalism. Systemically oppressed groups have been fighting capitalism for centuries. There's this idea that we need to give these people a voice, but the fact of the matter is these people have a voice and they have been fighting for much longer than we have. We just haven't been listening to them. When we think about Indigenous people, people of colour, people from groups who have faced the most systemic oppression, in my view, they are the ones who understand best what needs to change in this world, because they have experienced true suppression and violence at the hands of capitalism and the powers that be. We need to actively listen to them, and by listening, I mean actually understanding what they need and acting on that.
I hope that you know that we will never forget what you have done and what Shell has done. I hope you know that as the climate crisis gets more and more deadly, you will be to blame, and I will not be sharing this podium with you anymore.
After my confrontation with Ben Van Beurden, a few of the older women at the summit came up to me and they said that I should never get emotional in front of a powerful man and that I shouldn't have cried. But I really disagree with this, because I never want to censor myself for the purpose of looking powerful in the eyes of someone like Ben Van Beurden. And I think it's also important for people to see that emotion and to understand that the climate crisis is something that merits for us to be really upset and to be really emotionally invested in it, because it's such a serious issue and it's not going to go away unless we break down this system where people in power are completely unwilling to act and are actively destroying our futures. I think it's important to note that hope is not something that you actively have or don't have. It's something that you can create by being in spaces where you know that you're actively trying to push for a better world. And even though we live under such an oppressive system, you know, like, that's not forever, and we can rise up and fight against that. We just need more people to get involved and to realize that they have a voice and that they have power to make change.
Keep it carbon in the soil. People are not asking for this entity to be dismantled for no reason at all. Who doesn't want to feel safe? But if you are not making people feel safe and you're adding to the crime, you're adding to the pain that's already been inflicted in our communities, what do we need you for? If that measure would have passed, that would have really showed the community that they cared about what happened to George Floyd, that they cared about all of the people that led up to George Floyd. That would have really showed that it did make a difference, that we do care about lives beyond Caucasian lives. We actually do care about Black, Indigenous, and minority lives. A change in the structure and the reform passing would have made a big difference, because we need people to show up that are specifically trained and have a passion in certain areas. I've attended classes where I've seen how the police are trained, and they're basically trained like they're headed into war. When they go into our communities, they're not trained as if they're going into communities with other human beings. Having a mental health staff show up, someone that's trained, that has that capacity to deal with the situation. This was the epicenter. This was the beginning of hearing our voices, of hearing the cries of the people who have been crying out for help, that have been crying out for change. And they have a chance to set the tone. They have a chance to show the world that people's lives matter. No matter your skin color, no matter your economic status, no matter what you look like or what you have or don't have. If you hurt another human being, we will make the necessary changes. They had a chance to show that, and they didn't. They failed. There has been over 470 murders at the hands of law enforcement here in the state of Minnesota. And my son's father, Justin Tigan, was one of those murders. I provide support groups for families all over that have lost loved ones at the hands of the police. I see their pain. I've seen the mothers cry. It's a pain that I cannot describe to you. These are people that took an oath to protect and serve. And yet they have caused more pain to our community, and they go on with their lives and they go home to their families. You know, just because we're Black doesn't mean that we're not human beings. It doesn't mean that we don't love our loved ones that they took from us. They stole them from us. And we have to go on the rest of our lives knowing that we may never see justice because we're Black. We have to keep the hope in our hearts alive, even though it does get discouraging, even though it is hurtful, even though it is painful to keep going at times. It's hard to fight so hard for something and then nothing comes out of it. But it doesn't mean that nothing's going to come out of it overall. It just means that it didn't happen right now. I refuse to give up.
So,
greenwashing.
so thank you, Minister.
Can we have a few questions?
Thank you very much. Very nice. Thanks for the feedback and for the engagement today. It sounds like you've had a very constructive discussion. But we know a few things. First, we know we have a very limited carbon budget. Secondly, we know we need to preserve, because we're destroying nature, and then rebuild nature. And we know that we have to rely on the guardians of that nature, the indigenous peoples. You and I have spoken this, and entirely agree, who protect 80% of our biodiversity. We also know, and I heard it here, and I won't go into all the details, that it's not that which is the problem, it's the existing market that is the problem. It's small, it's fragmented, it's unprofessional, subject to greenwashing.
I like to call this the Coachella of climate change because it kind of is. You have fancy men in fancy suits, some with 80 cars coming in, booking out entire hotels, and then the rest of us trying to find places to sleep and considering lodging on a boat because we can't find areas on land.
Within the venue, the events that we can access are basically none. We have to be on side events. We went through so much trouble to get this little piece of paper right here with, our names on it so that we could go inside of the blue zone. And we are just sitting in the common areas because we are not allowed into the decision-making spaces. We are not allowed because you have to get tickets to go in, and people who get tickets are people who have connections and people who didn't have to fight to come here.
Every stage, the word youth is coming out of people's mouths left and right. Like, they've used us to a point where it's like ridiculous, but none of us are invited. I think it's criminal how much Airbnbs, hotels are charging for people to lodge here. Flight prices have gone up the roof. Food here is ridiculously expensive, and that's just from the financial aspect. There was train strikes for weeks at an end. Taxi cabs are probably the only form of transportation. And then the venue itself. For disabled folk, it is absolutely inaccessible. They have revolving doors. You can't get in with a wheelchair.
A lot of people maybe can't participate on both days, but do the effort to come out and just share the space with people. We have to show governments that we are still coming out, that we're still protesting, and not one protest is going to change the world, but looking at history, consistency is what changes the world. Mass demonstrations is what changes the world, and it shouldn't be like that, but it is what sways governments and politicians to realize that people are willing to show up